how does TTIP relate to what you call new constitutionalism and disciplinary neoliberalism?
Well, disciplinary neoliberalism is perhaps the concept to start with, because what's happened in the world over the last 30 years has been a gigantic shift in the global political economy towards the neoliberal re-regulation of economic and political and social activities, which is basically a discourse of political economy that is intended to institutionalize the power of capital. New constitutionalism is the legal and juridical counterpart. It develops constitutional, legal and regulatory mechanisms to lock in that power through legislation, etc., and agreements such as TTIP, trade and investment agreements, and in so doing it seeks to lock out democratic forces in the making of fundamental policies to govern our economies and societies.
In what way does TTIP also reflect a crisis of democracy?
Well, it is negotiated in secret. It has proposed adjudication mechanisms, which are basically privatized adjudication mechanisms. It empowers corporations. It gives corporations certain rights and freedoms. So it's a very peculiar version of the rule of law insofar as the institutions of representative democracy and popular participation are not in any significant way involved in the making of this policy. The adjudication of this policy is not in open courts through traditional mechanisms of adjudication by judges. So it's almost a kind of self-regulation on behalf of capital, governed by constitutional protections that lock out forms of democratic participation that we've been traditionally used to.
What protests have you observed so far in North America against TTIP?
I personally have not witnessed any. I think there's been a relative silence in Canada. I think there has been more resistance in the United States, although in Canada, certain organizations such as the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives are a kind of hub for the kinds of collective resistance we've seen in Europe. I think in Europe it's very, very widespread. I believe as many as 400 organizations have been involved in resistance and protests against TTIP, and over 3 million people signed a petition, which was a kind of legally official protest requesting intervention in the process. But the European Commission we will accept this petition, but you're not allowed to propose legislation. That's the duty of governments and bureaucrats in Brussels.
What do you take with you from yesterday's podium and from the conference so far, from all the analyses you heard so far?
Well, I found that one of the most interesting things I've taken was during the discussion, where it became clear to me that there was a level of sophistication amongst the forces resisting TTIP and similar initiatives such as the CETA and the alphabet soup of these agreements. But people were thinking well beyond those. In other words, they were thinking about what the fundamental aspects of economic and social policy were, what was the dominant framework of that policy, and how to think beyond them. In other words, to think beyond the confines of what could be called the ordinary politics and the ordinary discussion of these things. To think about what kind of society people want to see, how it relates to the problem of climate change, the threats to the biosphere, and so on. And it became clearer to me that there is a lot more going on here than I thought was the case when I flew in from Canada. So I was very encouraged by that. To use the phraseology I used in my presentation, I came with a bit of the pessimism of the intelligence about the situation, and I've gone away with a little bit more optimism of the will to create something interesting, important, and progressive.